This isn't going to be about Jesus, is it?
Well, that music sounds familiar. Where do I know that from? Hello, friends. Greg Koukl, Stand to Reason, back in the saddle again after, what's it been, 3 weeks? Kind of out of play. Not entirely. Been working a little bit, Wisconsin and Minnesota, but been relaxing a lot. And every year it's good to take a few weeks away with the family and get up in the North Woods and do some fishing, wet a line, fight off the mosquito hordes, the wood ticks, the deer ticks, but just be up there in the wild country with my family. And that's where I've been for the last few weeks, and been a reasonably restful vacation. You know, vacations work out, you know, that you go for a rest, and then when you come back, you need a vacation from your vacation. It wasn't quite that bad because we weren't on the run all the time. But it is nice to be back in the saddle and talking with you, and I look forward to doing that today on our show, Stand to Reason. I haven't mentioned that yet. And I'm Greg Koukl. Did I mention that? And I'll be looking forward to conversation with you. First hour, we'll take some calls. I have a thought I want to offer you here as we start out, and then take some of your calls. The last 2 hours, though, I am going to be in conversation with one of my mentors, the one who is actual influence on me has been greater than anybody else in my life, certainly as a Christian thinker, J.P. Moreland. And we are going to be talking about the soul and his book by that title. He's written a number regarding that issue, but I probably have learned more about him in that broader area than anything else. And indeed, my daughter and I, 2 days ago, were having a conversation that was the fruit of J.P. Moreland's influence in my life, specifically on the soul. So we'll be spending the last 2 hours of this show on that topic. And if you're listening live to this hour, please get the podcast for today to catch those 2 hours with JP. They'll be worth it. There are odds and ends I could tell you about my vacation. Too many shy dogs, too many what's a scoop ice creams, and it's not really ice cream. It's more like custard. There's probably more lard I should say more calories, more fat in a scoop of what's a scoop ice cream than there is in a scoop of lard. But nevertheless, those weren't the things that have actually stood out for me. I mean, that's all fine and dandy. It's in the background. It's what happens every vacation. And no bizarre thing happened to me like has happened in the past that I can tell you my tale of woe. But since there are callers on board, I want to get quickly to another issue that had to do with something that took place in Wisconsin but was unrelated to the geography. I was in our I call it a cabin, but when I say our cabin in northern Wisconsin, I think you would probably envision something different than is what is actually there. It's more of a modest abode that was built 50 years ago and is showing its age a bit. In any event, we were there, and my daughter Annabeth, who is 9, is a reader. And so when on the weekends we go to garage sales or maybe in the area or go to thrift stores or the like, and even on vacation, those are some of the habits we pursue, just like in regular year. She picked up a book by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Now, she's read virtually all those books. She stumbled upon one that she had not read before, and she was really excited to read it. And this may have been Wilder's last book. I'm not sure. But when I came home one day last week, I came home to a very morose young lady, my daughter, who had been actually very upset and weeping as a result of finishing that book. Now, I didn't talk to her that day about it, though my wife told me a little bit at the time what was going on. She read the ending of this book by Wilder, and it had a deep impact on her. I knew the ending of this book not because I'd read it myself, but I'd heard actually philosopher William Lane Craig talk about it, when he was discussing the nature of time and eternity and God's relationship to those things. And in the conversation, he was talking about when you are temporal, that is, when you participate in temporal acts, when you're in time, so to speak, there was a certain kind of tragic, one might say, quality to it, and that is that the present drifts into the past in a way that you cannot recover it. You lose something. You lose the present into the past. And the older you get, of course, the more you're aware of this. And my 64th birthday happened just a couple of weeks ago, and so I am increasingly aware of that fact. And when Dr. Craig was talking about this issue in his lecture on God, Time, and Eternity, which is available, by the way, through Stand to Reason, you can get that DVD set or CD set, whatever it is. It's a talk. He mentioned Wilder's writings. And in this particular book, at the end of the book, Wilder is listening as a young girl now to her father, I think, playing a fiddle or singing Auld Lang Syne. And she asked what that is. And he said, well, that's like for old time's sake or something to that effect. And she said, well, what is old times? I don't understand. And time's gone by. What is that? And he explained it to her, these are things in the past. And she reflects there at the end of her piece about how the present moment could ever be less than completely real. Because here she is, right in the presence of Pa and Ma and in the cabin and on the prairie and experiencing this rich life. And how could this ever be something less than real? How could this ever disappear? How could this ever go away? But of course, Ma and Pa have gone away. And the prairie has gone away, and the cabin has gone away, and Wilder has gone away, and all of that has gone away, and it's all drifted into the past. And as my daughter read that, it had a profound impact on her. She felt the sense of passage of time. She felt the weight of that even as a 9-year-old. Now, I'm not doing this to showcase my daughter. I think I'm saying this for two reasons. One, because the conversation that we had that I'll tell you about what was touching to me. And so I'm just sharing a personal anecdote. And it also has larger ramifications that you might be thinking about for yourself or even in the training of your own children. 2 days ago, we took a hike in the Southern California hills, and she didn't particularly want to go. She's more of a homebody and a reader, and I had to roust her out. But she finally came willingly, and we were hiking, just the two of us, and we're talking as we were climbing the hill. And I asked her about what happened a week ago when she read the Wilder book. And she told me, because we hadn't talked about it yet, I just knew from what Mom had said. She told me that she read the story and it made her really sad. And I said, what was it that made you sad, honey? And she said, well, I realized that something I really, really loved, I was going to lose. I said, what is that? And she said, my childhood. Now, it chokes me up just to think of it. For one, it was nice to hear that she really loved her childhood. And as a summary statement, though, there's ups and downs, and every parent sees that. But it was also, and I don't know how to explain this other than to say I was deeply satisfied to hear my daughter thinking substantively on this issue, that she read this in the book and this had an impact. This she thought of. This she weighed with regards to her own life. And I don't know that she'd ever done that thing quite like that before. But I had been thinking about it. In fact, I told her that. I said, honey, I understand what you're talking about. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and indeed triggered by the same story that triggered the thoughts in her. And then went on to explain that, as an adult, there are things that you gain, even though you're losing your childhood, you're moving into a stage of life where, yes, you're losing something, and you're losing something that's valuable, and there's no way around that. But and by the way, it's largely gone. I mean, you remember some details, but I'm just thinking, what do I remember from when I was 9 years old? Almost nothing. Maybe if there are pictures to trigger things, and nowadays you have DVDs and movies and photos and in abundance like you didn't have when I was a kid and growing up, to kind of help you to recall what is back in your memory somewhere darkly and jog that memory. But by and large, our childhoods, in terms of the details, are largely lost. Now, what isn't lost is the impact of the things that happened and the ways that children are formed during that time. And of course, my goal is not simply to build memories like a memory of this thing, this event, catching that fish, for example, with my daughter, but that she remember being with Papa and fishing. And that this does something for her heart, this association, which means also I want my girls to have pleasant associations when they think of my face and my being in their life. It's another issue. I've talked about it before, but some of us don't have those kinds of associations when we think of our parents. But this has been a goal for me in thinking of those things. But I told her, look, honey, you lose those things. They're gone. But you're going to gain something. When you get older, you gain privileges. You get more responsibility. You gain privileges. And then she asked me as we're hiking along, well, Papa, what's it like to be a grown-up? Now, that is not an easy question to answer. In fact, that's what I told her. Partly because it's different for different people, but also because it's complex. There's a lot of things involved in being a grown-up, and grown-ups know that. But I think it's fair to say, I offered her, it's hard if done right. If you're the right kind of grown-up, it's hard. Now, this might strike you as unusual because most of us think, or the tendency is to think, let's make life easier, and I'm shooting for making life easier, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm doing it all the time. But the fact of the matter is that life in a fallen world, lived as a grown-up, is hard. And I clarified for her what I understand adulthood to mean, or being a grown-up to entail. And that is, one, taking responsibility. Adults take burdens on their shoulders. In fact, we rescue children from those burdens and we take them on ourselves. We carry those burdens so that our children will not have to carry them. We take responsibility. Now, we get rewarded for that because we have liberties and privileges that we wouldn't have, or we don't have when we're younger. In a perfect world, the reward for taking responsibility is privileges. Now, a lot of people are given privileges with no responsibility, and we call that growing up fast. Well, that's not growing up at all. That's corrupting. Children nowadays are not growing up fast. They are getting the privileges without the responsibility, and they're just getting corrupted faster. That's it. But I told her being an adult means taking responsibility, and secondly, making a contribution. That is, leaving a mark, doing something good, not just being there, not just consuming, but making a difference. And I mentioned, and that's challenging, that's hard. But being faced with those challenges of being an adult, having left childhood behind, and having, in a sense, graduated and feeling the pain of the loss of that thing she loved, she will gain something that, in a certain sense, is more valuable. It's going to be harder, but it is the hardness that makes the thing valuable. You get to take responsibility for yourself and for others, and you can make a contribution. Now, I said, For some people, it's not so hard. And that's because they've got enough money to take the pain out of being an adult. Or I should say, maybe not the pain, but maybe the toil or the difficulty. Yeah, I guess I do mean pain. But it's more than just pain. It's the toil. It's the burden. Some people have enough money to avoid the burden of being a grown-up. And they can distract themselves with pleasures and dodge responsibilities. And I guess nowadays we'd call that living the good life. I saw in the airport a magazine, Rob Lowe on the cover, the actor. I think it was Cigar Aficionado, now that I think about it. And there it said, Rob Lowe, living the good life. Of course, you understand what they think the good life means, and that is avoiding responsibility. And I'm not saying Rob Lowe is irresponsible. I don't know anything about him personally, but I'm just, you know what they're after. Living the good life means that life of ease, the life of Riley, easy street. That's what those terms mean, avoiding the difficulties. But I told my daughter, I said, if you live on easy street like that, you avoid the difficulties, you do not get the benefit that the hard things and the hard things alone can give you. Here we were climbing this Southern California, well, we wouldn't call it a mountain. People in Wisconsin would call it a mountain, but here we just call it a hill. The foothills of Southern California. What, 1,000 foot of elevation as we're hiking up this. Was this easy? No, it was hard. It was harder for her than it was for me. But as we came down, I asked her, how does she feel? Remember, she didn't really want to go at first. She's a homebody. She's a sit and read kind of person. It's hard to pry her out of her shell and get her moving. But she was compliant and said she'd go with Papa, and off she went. And then coming down the hill, she said, I'm glad I did it. Yes, it was hard, and now we've done it. We've accomplished it. Now we're going downhill, and we are imbibing of the pleasure of having done something difficult, somewhat difficult. And so this was a little microcosm here in our hike of what I was trying to get across to her about life, stepping out of childhood, and beginning very slowly, very modestly to embrace young adulthood. And some of you might know that the word teenager is not in my vocabulary for these kinds of things. My girls will never be teenagers. They will be young adults. That is my mentality here. And again, I'm not showcasing this as a goal, not something I'm saying about them. It's something I'm saying about me and about vocabulary. The concept of being a teenager is 20th century. Before that, kids were kids, and then they were young adults, and then they were full-fledged adults. They moved into positions of responsibility, taking responsibility for themselves and for others and making a contribution. They didn't move into this crazy time of 10 or 15 years of being wild and doing nothing and being taken care of, and having parents think, well, if they're still alive and not in jail and not on drugs or something like that, then we've made a success. That's the bar is too low there. No, I want young adults. And as my daughter begins to embrace young adulthood, there is going to be, obviously, this transition pain. And it was a sweet thing to be able to talk about it. I ended with a verse. I don't always do that, but I mentioned something in Romans 12, and I told her, I said, that book is about hardship. I'm sorry, not Romans, but Hebrews 12, and suffering. And I mentioned to her that the writer of Hebrews says that he used the word discipline. I think I said difficulty, because that's it, training. The hardship of life, all the hardship of life seems not at the moment to be joyful. It's not fun, but sorrowful. I mean, it's a bummer to go through the hard thing, hiking up. But afterwards, the writer says, for those who have been trained by it, yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. The fun is more fun when the work is done, is another way of putting it. All right, enough said. For now, let's take a break and get to your calls here on Stand to Reason.
You can find STR on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, and Pinterest. Interact with STR staff, post comments, get involved with other like-minded Christians. Want to know what is going on with STR? Speaking events, new podcasts, resources, and articles? Follow STR online. You can find all of our social media connections at str.org.
Show a stand to reason, ladies and gentlemen. Greg Koukl here, giving you a piece of my mind. Now, I want to say, as I often do, I usually do, with you every week on Tuesday nights live, wherever your broadcast is being heard now. The live show Tuesdays from 4 until 7, but I've just come off from being away for quite a long time. So, listen, we've got a new Facebook page. I get the terms mixed up here. We used to be a group. We're going to a page because it gives us more flexibility to do fun things for you guys. If you've if you've signed up and got friended on the page, on the group, go to the page and like the page, because eventually in the next few weeks we'll transition. The page will be gone and the group will be there. Just wanted to let you know. So start going to the page instead of the group. You can find it. If you know how to navigate in Facebook, it won't be any trouble at all. If you go back to the old group, then you'll get instructions on how to get to the page. Anyway, I'd like to let you know about that transition. Okay, let's go to our first caller here, Mike in Santa Barbara. Mike, welcome to Stand to Reason. First guy on board here today.
Hi, Greg. How you doing?
Doing good. Glad to be back in the saddle, like I said.
Yeah, good. I missed you last week. I actually met you at a Biola Apologetics Conference in San Jose last year. Actually, you and Lee Strobel were there, and it was a great conference.
Good. Yeah, I remember that. It was a big, giant church in San Jose. I spoke at the Sunday service, gave my testimony, and talked about no pixie dust.
It was great. And, at that conference, Lee had mentioned his experiences with the Seeker small group, and it really had an impact on me, and so much that I'm actually starting a ministry here in Santa Barbara with Seeker small groups. And I was talking about that with my son-in-law, and he said, "What kind of questions are you going to be talking about?" And in that conversation, he posed the following question. He says, the Bible clearly teaches the omnipresence of God, even in hell. Psalm 139. Right. Where shall I go from your spirit? Yep. Where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. But Scripture also talks about the separation of God, the sinner's separation of God. My God, why have you forsaken me? Of course. And so the basic question comes down to, how can someone be separated from God if God is omnipresent, if God is everywhere? Isn't that a contradiction?
Well, it's only a contradiction if they are. Let me back. The law of non-contradiction says this: A cannot be not A at the same time in the same way. So if the sense of separation that you've talked about, like, for example, my God, why have you forsaken me? If the sense of separation there is a different kind of thing than the omnipresence of God, then there's no contradiction. And that's the key. Let's just take Jesus' remark there on the cross, and there he's quoting Psalm 22, the opening of Psalm 22. My God, why are you distant from me? No, it doesn't say distant, like why are you away from me? And though even if it had said that, I think there wouldn't be a problem. But he says in that place, why have you forsaken me? Now the next verse there in Psalm 22 reads, far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. That is, there Jesus is on the cross being forsaken of God. Now, is God consciously present in that circumstance? Yes, God is there. God is, but he is not helping Jesus. He is, in fact, pouring his anger and wrath out on Jesus. In one sense, it is the problem for Jesus, and the reason that he utters this is because of the presence of God there. God bringing the wrath on him. okay? So you have God omnipresent. He is present everywhere. But in terms of the relational, the nature of the relationship of the Father and the Son at that point, something's different. Instead of there being the communion that he had known, now there was the anger and wrath of the Father being poured out on him. And he is crying in his groans, but he is not being delivered from it. He is being forsaken by the Father, which is an entirely different aspect of their relationship. You know, it was utter misery for Jesus. So there's no contradiction in the omnipresence of God once we understand, one, what omnipresence means, that is that God is consciously present everywhere. There is no way where we can go and hide from God, where God isn't clearly, fully aware of everything that's going on around us.
So take, for example, those in eternal damnation, say in hell, even though they're in the presence of God, they have no relationship with Him.
Yes,
and,
that's right.
And that in itself is an awful thing in terms of what you'll experience in heaven.
Yeah,
it's more relational than physical.
Right. Are you married?
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
okay, look at every single married guy or married woman for that matter. I mean, there may be some exceptions to this, but I tell you, they're rare. Knows what it's like to be in the presence of their spouse, but momentarily at least be separated in terms of relationship. I mean, so we can be with somebody in one way and not with them in a different kind of way. And we are with them physically, within their physical presence, if you will, but we are not with them relationally. Our relationship is broken or hindered or hampered or impaired in some sense. And so there is no contradiction there. We just have to zero in on the different ways in which we're present with each other. We're present in one way, but not in another. And this is the same kind of thinking that saves us from the charge of contradiction about God's omnipresence. Yes, God is omnipresent, but that doesn't mean that people are enjoying the fruits of his company. Sometimes him being present to them, they are receiving his punishment, like in hell,
wrath. Yeah.
Or his wrath.
Yeah.
And no contradiction at all in that circumstance. And it's interesting, I cited I cited the law of non-contradiction. And it almost seems like, what's the word I'm looking for? Pedantic to do it the way I did it. But in the definition are the seeds of the answer. So when people claim, well, that's a contradiction, it's sometimes good to retrieve the rule itself to see whether or not the instance that is being described is a violation or not, if there's a genuine contradiction. And once again, the rule is A cannot be not A at the same time and in the same way.
Yes. And I think that, I'm looking at Isaiah 59:2, but your iniquities have separated you from your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he will not hear. The word separated, I mean, we have a normal definition of what that term means in terms of physical separation.
Right.
And we just have to go deeper and understand in what sense you're separated,
right.
whether it's physically or emotionally. Yeah.
Yeah, well, clearly it's not physically, because it is impossible to be separated from God. For one, God is not physical, so we can't put physical distance between our physical selves and his physical self, which is what we mean by physical separation. And secondly, God is omnipresent, so, the separation must be something else.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, how does that verse go again?
But your iniquities have separated you from your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you so that he will not hear.
Right. Okay, so hidden his face so he won't hear. So here you have language that clearly is not literal or physical. He has no face, he has no ears. What it means is that we are not enjoying the relationship that God provides because of the sin, and so we're cut off in terms of relationship. And part of that relationship is a response of God to the requests that we offer, and He does not respond. So, curiously, most people don't even think, when they read a piece like that, they know exactly what the author is trying to communicate. But this question that has been posed to you is something that comes up with some frequency. So people are not thinking about how these concepts interact. But I hope that helps.
Very good. Thank you, Greg.
All right, Mike, I appreciate your call. Let's see. We got Matt here in Lancaster. I haven't even read your question yet, so surprise me. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Greg. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thanks.
I'm sorry. I had a frog in my throat, so I don't know how that came out.
Yeah, that's all right.
Anyway, so my question has to do with the issue of homosexuality and same-sex marriage.
Uh-huh.
They're related. There's a distinction, and so just in that general area.
Right. Okay.
I've heard you say before, and I agree with you, that the issue of homosexuality isn't very high on the theological pecking order.
Uh-huh.
And so the question just is, why should a Christian living today be involved or engaged with the conversation that is going around with homosexuality? The reason being is because, in my own case, I'm studying theology, philosophy, apologetics, not in a formal sense, just in an informal sense, reading books, listening to lectures and stuff. And so, like in theology, I'm just reading books in the order how systematic theology books are formatted. The theology of God,
right,
creation, man, sin. Same thing with philosophy.
Right. That's called systematic theology.
Theology.
Right. The categories of theological information: God,
Yes,
Jesus, man, Holy Spirit, etc.
Right, and the same thing goes with philosophy, studying logic, epistemology, metaphysics, and that
Ethics,
kind of
right.
general, those general categories. And so my kind of stance is, well, I don't know that part about ethics, or I haven't read the book of Hezekiah yet, but when I get to it, I'll believe whatever that says too. And so, ought a Christian take that same approach when dealing with homosexuality, or is there some significance because of today's culture and how it's situated with the issue of homosexuality that requires more attention?
There's a couple of things here. One of them, it's interesting the way you put it, and you talk about Hezekiah. I don't really study that, but when I get to that, then I'll focus on it. In other words, when the time comes, you're not going to go out of your way to seek that one out because it may not be the most important one right now, but when the time comes and you get to it, then you'll give your attention to it. I understand that entirely. With regards to the homosexuality issue, that time has come, is kind of what I'm saying. We have gotten to it, or put more precisely, it's gotten to us. We are on the defensive here. This isn't something that Christians have, characteristically nowadays, have gone out and picked fights regarding. This is something that has come after us, that we are being pushed back hard on. And since now it's right at our door, then we are obliged to deal with it. And this goes to the second factor, which is you talked about the kind of cultural issue or the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist, or how different ways to characterize it. Every era has, for lack of a better way of putting it, its issues. Every era for Christians has its watershed concerns. And when this issue has come up, when I've mentioned it, and I'm flattered you remember my comments about this not being top issue, so I appreciate your listening, but right around when I talk about that, I draw another illustration, and the illustration is with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Aryan paragraph in the 30s in Germany, where the Aryan paragraph was a requirement that Jews not be given positions of leadership in the culture, and this would apply to the church as well. What Jews are in the church? The Jews that have converted to Christianity. They're still ethnic Jews, but they are by faith Christians now. And according to the Aryan paragraph, pastors were not allowed to give Jews any position of authority or leadership in the church. Now, the New Testament teaches that there is neither Jew nor Gentile in the church, okay? One could argue that is not high on the theological pecking order. I'm getting a little feedback there on your mic. I don't know if or rather on your phone. I don't know if you're rubbing something or maybe you're just a little close to it, but I just started noticing it. It's not high on the pecking order, but it became the issue. That was the line in the sand that was being drawn at the time. And what Bonhoeffer understood, along with the other Christian leaders in the confessing church, is they understood that this was an example of the culture, specifically the government, dictating what the church was going to be like, instead of Christ dictating what the church was to be like. And Bonhoeffer saw it for what it was and made a goal line stand along with the confessing Christians and just said, no, we're not going to do this. And that's an example, or I should say that's parallel with the circumstances I think we're facing now. Neither of these issues are big theological issues. Lots of things much more important, but these have been brought to us. These are the ones in front of us. This is the line in the sand that the culture is drawing, and it's demanding that we step over the line in the sand to make common cause with them over and against fidelity with Christ. And that's why, in my view, this is a critical issue. Was it John? In 1 John says, friendship with the world is enmity towards God. Friendship with the world is enmity towards God. In the book of Proverbs, it talks about the fear of man is a snare. I think part of what's going on here is the culture is threatening Christians on this issue. And many Christians are crossing over the line because they fear man more than God, and they are going to be ensnared by this. And in so doing, they are making common cause with the world and being friends with the world in a completely inappropriate way. And they are being unfaithful to Christ. When seen in those terms, I think the gravity of this issue becomes clear, at least in my own mind.
Okay. What about, well, I don't really buy this for many Christians, but some would say, well, the other side, well, not necessarily the other side, but there are some Christians who say homosexuality is okay, and you've addressed this in some of your talks, which have been very good. For those that say, well, I just, don't want to really get involved right now, and I'll just keep following Jesus, but won't really focus in on this. I just want to give them the gospel, even though I don't want to focus in on this and make this a divisive issue, even though it kind of already is a divisive issue.
Well, I think there's merit in that, and the point is that you don't try to cause trouble. Trouble is coming our way, though. And so I have notes in front of me of advice that I gave somebody about 6 weeks ago who works in I think the wedding photography business. And he says, what am I going to do when somebody calls and asks me if I'll do a same-sex wedding? Well, he didn't want to do that because of his conscience, but the law looks like it's not going to be on his side. So here's a guy who can't just follow Jesus, in some general way. His livelihood is going to be on the line. So we have individual Christians who can't just bypass this because it's coming to them in spades and in force. They're not going to be able to parry it or bypass it or stay out of the line of fire. Many Christians will be able to stay out of the line of fire. That's fine. We don't want to cause more problems than there are. I don't think homosexuality should ever be the issue of evangelism, because if a person wasn't gay, there'd be some other sin that that would be the issue. So, and it's not just any individual sin; it's sinfulness, it's rebellion, and I think we ought to approach people on that basis.
Right.
So, that's my general take on it. If you can avoid the problem, avoid it. But sometimes we can't, and when the culture draws a line in the sand, when it makes a goal line stand, so to speak, this is where then for us it's time to put up or shut up kind of thing. We have to step up to that And as my brother Mark put it, he said, we had to draw our own line in the sand. And that line, their line is called tolerance. Our line is called faithfulness. And we have to stay, on our side of that line. And we have to be careful to comport ourselves in godly ways when we engage in all of that stuff. But this is not going away, Matt. This is not.
Yeah.
All righty?
All right. Thanks a lot, Greg.
Okay, got to run. I appreciate your call. Alan Schleman just did a Twitter fest or whatever you call that a half hour ago, finished it. I don't know, there's a name for it, where he has kind of like a conference on Twitter, which would be really hard for a guy like me because I just have too many letters. It's difficult to give short answers to things. But a Twitter Q&A, thank you, Melinda, a Twitter Q&A. So if you go to, is it on Stand to Reason's Twitter? Yeah, Stand to Reason's Twitter. You can follow the entire conversation where people raised issues and he gave short response. It's what is that? # STRASK. # STRASK. Hashtag. Well, it's a # too. It's a hashtag. It's a tic-tac-toe. All right, we got it. Let's go to break. Hashtag STRASK, and you'll get the whole conversation and everything that Alan contributed to that broader conversation. We'll go to break and back for some more calls here, and then top of the hour, our conversation with J.P. Moreland.
At Stand to Reason, we depend on the support of donors to carry on our mission to equip Christian ambassadors, and your non-cash donation items can help. You can transform your old cars, cell phones, or other items into ministry impact by donating them to Stand to Reason. Think of it. Because of your donation, Christians just like you will be able to effectively share their faith and change the lives of others forever. To make non-cash donations of all kinds to Stand to Reason, call iDonate at 877-897-4273 or go to idonate.com and visit STR's page. They'll take care of everything for you and Stand to Reason. Just call them at 877-897-4273 or visit idonate.com. Thank you very much for making Stand to Reason's work possible.
Rethink is coming up, ladies and gentlemen. That's the Orange County version. This is the third year running here. Rethink, training a new generation of young Christians to rethink their worldview. It's September 26th and 27th, Orange County, Crossline Church, same place we had the last couple of years. It's now's the time for early registration. We already have people registering, even though we're, 2 months out. It's still, we still have people queuing up for this. It was a great success last year. I think 600 students showed up, and their youth leaders and parents in some cases. Early bird registration is $29, and that ends in about 2 weeks, August 15th. Pre-conference registration, $39, at the door, $49. So if you act quickly, you can save some cash. Greg Koukl will be speaking, Alan Schleman, I'll be there, Sean McDowell, Tim Barnett, JP. We have lots of folks that are going to be really laying it out for you and for your kids. So take a look at, what is it, rethink.org? Is that, what is our URL for that now? I don't have it on this sheet, but you can go to str.org. Oh, here it is, rethinkapologetics.com. It's right here. Yes, it is. rethinkapologetics.com for all the information. All right, let's go back to calls here on Stand to Reason to Boise, Idaho, and Chris. Hey, Chris.
Hi, Greg.
Yeah.
Good to talk to you. Hey,
Thank you.
I've heard you said a couple times that the early Christians were pacifists, and that they conquered, the Roman world, and the only blood they shed was their own.
Right.
But how come we're not pacifists? How come modern Christianity, modern Christians are not pacifists if the early Christians were?
Well, it depends on the reason why early Christians were pacifists. In order to serve in the military in the Roman Empire, you had to swear fealty to the emperor as a god. And since they weren't going to do that, they could not be allowed in the army. So the reason that they didn't fight or at least one of the significant reasons is that they wouldn't fight is because they couldn't qualify for being a soldier in the realm under those conditions. Not necessarily that Christianity itself taught pacifism, because if Christianity taught pacifism per se, then we would find such teaching in the Scriptures, but we do not. The New Testament, neither the New Testament nor the Old Testament, I guess with the case of the Old Testament, obviously not the Old Testament, is pacifism taught. God is not a pacifist. So there's no textual reasons. There are no theological or textual reasons that justifies strict pacifism.
So it's not. So it's mainly enrollment in the army as opposed to, defending yourself if you're being attacked. Like, the one verse that I'm thinking about is, don't resist an evil person or an evil man. Mm-hmm. And but so are you saying it's mostly like the military? But
I think that's a huge part of it. Now, there is a strong element or ethic in the New Testament on peace, but that is having peace between individuals. So, in fact, I was just focusing on this yesterday and today, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So we have a lot being said in the New Testament on peace between parties, that we're not having warring factions. This is critical within the church, but we are also told to be at peace with all men. Now, I don't think, this is an opinion at this point, I don't think that is intended to be extended without borders to that ethic. We are to be at peace with all men, but sometimes being at peace with all men is not possible. And therefore, whether it is the local government that is using individuals to enforce the peace in a way that God intended for governments, the punishment of evildoers or the praise of those who do wrong, or whether there are armies that are like large police forces for international policing, I think in either of those cases, there is a legitimacy to armed conflict, even lethal conflict. And we have a lot of that in the Old Testament. So I think that certainly in personal relationships, this is something that we're to press and we are to seek out, but that is not to exclude the idea of something like a just war. And I think part of the reason you're going to see the pacifism in the early part of the church's history, the reason I mentioned is that to be in the military, participating there required an oath of fidelity to Caesar in a way that was not acceptable to Christians who were monotheists. Secondly, you have an ethic. The Christians were generally peaceful people. They weren't looking to start a fight with people. They were looking to create peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, to create peaceful circumstances. And so those are some of the reasons. The real question is, does the Scriptures teach strict pacifism, that violence of any kind against another human being is wrong under every circumstance? And it just strikes me, this is obviously false. Even though Jesus offered some of these sayings, like in the Sermon on the Mount, turn the other cheek, etc. Those are passages that refer principally to taking individual. What's the word I'm looking for? To be taking individual retaliation.
Well, if someone's attacking me on the street or attacking my wife, and am I supposed to turn the other cheek, or is there, a place?
No, I don't think you're supposed. I don't think that's what Jesus meant when he said turn the other cheek. Let me get to cheek in a minute. Let me tell you the third thing I just remembered again. Mm-hmm. The early Christians were happy to die for Christ. They were happy. not in every single case, but there was kind of an odd ethic that people who were saints expected to be martyred and wanted to be martyred for the cause of Christ. I mean, I know it's hard for us to connect with that, but for them to say, no, I'm not going to fight in Nero's army, and if that means I die, good. Because to die is gain, and to be sacrificed for Christ is a sign of spiritual dignity and a future reward. Fine, take my life. So that was another element, I think, that added to the pacification of the early church, or the ideas, or the peaceful tone of the early church. But it is not, I think, because they had a general ethic that said retaliation of any kind, resistance of any kind of violence is ipso facto wrong. And the only way we'd be able to establish that, I mean, there were people, I'm sure, that believed that, but I don't think that was the main thrust. Anything about the early church, though, has to ultimately survive the assessment of Scripture itself. So the early church was wrong on lots of things. Just read the First Corinthians, and you could see how quickly, or Galatians, Paul says how quickly you've been gone astray.
Right.
So we ought to take counsel from the early church and the early church writers. We just want to be careful not to view it on the same level of Holy Scripture. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. There are lots of things. I really should. I would be good if I knew more about the early church than I do, but that would be true, not just me, but all of us, and it's also true of a whole bunch of other things that I wish I knew more about. This is the curse of information, and the curse of time. There's always twice as much life to live as there is life to live it. You know what I'm talking about? So, it's interesting. Oh, I didn't address the turning the other cheek thing. Now, it's interesting the way Jesus put this, and I'm not the only person who noticed this. A number of other people have pointed this out. The way Jesus puts it, and I don't have my Bible right in front of me right now, but he says, if anybody strikes you on the right cheek, offer the left to him also. Now, how is it? Most people are right-handed. How does a right-handed person strike somebody else on the right cheek? That would be kitty corner to their right hand, right?
Backhand.
A backhand. So it's a backhanded slap. Well, a backhanded slap is an insult. And so Jesus is saying not to retaliate to insults, to personal affronts. Don't return evil for evil, is what Jesus is saying there. And then Jesus was an example of this. He didn't return evil for evil. But it is interesting, when Jesus was slapped himself in a circumstance when we got some details about it. Now, he was beaten by the soldiers, but he was also slapped first at his trial. Mm-hmm. And in that case, Jesus did not turn the other cheek, which strikes me as itself as a exaggeration for the sake of effect. Jesus didn't, okay, hit me on the other one now. What Jesus did is he held the person who struck him to account for his actions. He said, if I have done wrong, bear witness to the wrong, and if I have not done wrong, then why did you strike me? Now that, to me, is really clever. Jesus, even himself, when he was struck in the face or slapped, he didn't just simply turn. Rather, he held the person to account for the behavior. Mm-hmm. So I think that ought to inform our understanding of that particular passage. And also the detail about the right hand being struck on the right cheek. This is personal retaliation, and that's what's prohibited. I tell my daughters all the time, don't return evil for evil. And I find just when the times when I get angry in relationships, my first impulse is to do that. And there's lots of clever ways that, we learn to do that, to acts of silence, or whatever, all the things that husbands do and wives do and people do in relationships. But it's just returning evil for evil, and that's what we should be doing. All right?
All right.
All right, Chris, thanks so much for your call. That's it for this hour, friends. Coming up next, Dr. J.P. Moreland. We'll have 2 full hours with him, and you might get just 1 hour on your broadcast. That's all right. Get the podcast, or maybe tune in the following week for the second edition of that discussion. Coming up after break. I'm Greg Koukl. You've been listening to Stand to Reason.